I would like to welcome James up to the stage.
Thanks very much, Dennis, Jeff, Megan, and the whole crew. This is an amazing event. I've met a whole bunch of really cool people, and excited to be here, and especially grateful that you guys are all up at 8 in the morning, or I guess like 5 a.m. for people that are coming from the West Coast. There's a couple of hands over here, highly caffeinated hands. As Dennis said, I wanted to tell a bit of a story about technological disruption, and particularly focusing on this problem that we're increasingly having around the proliferation of channels. But I really wanted to start the story back at a time of another technological disruption in the 60s and 70s, where the publishing industry, in particular the general interest publications, newspapers like the New York Times, were undergoing a similarly gut-wrenching upheaval in the way that they produced their media. So this was the way that at the Times we used to create the newspaper in the 1960s, hot type technology with manual insertion of letters, with molten lead holding them apart, and all these metaphors that we see in terms like leading and spacing in our word processors today. These are these physical processes that were being thrown out in favor of much more advanced lithographic offset processes. And of course, there was incredible labor upheaval. The technology led to huge economic shifts. Our distribution looked pretty much the same before and afterwards. We had a great low-cost model that today we would refer to as child labor, but at the time was, the paper boy. Don't try that distribution model these days, or you'll get into a little bit more trouble. But that upheaval in the labor industry and the way that the publication sector related to its workforce led to a series of rolling strikes and massive changes in the workforce that, in the case of New York City's metropolitan daily newspaper market, actually led to more than half of the daily newspapers that were in print, in business in the 1960s, no longer being there in the 1970s. So it's not the first time that the industry obviously has gone through a huge technological and economic cost-driven upheaval. And in fact, one of the papers in the 60s that was no longer there in the 70s was the New York Herald, which was where the New York's Herald Square got its name. And the Times publisher, Arthur Sulzberger, loves to tell a story about just how jealous his grandfather, also called Arthur Sulzberger, was that the New York Herald had a Herald Square named after them at the intersection of Broadway and 6th Avenue. And as the Times grew in prominence, it sort of followed Broadway up and pointed to the next intersection with the next big avenue at 6th Avenue, and managed to lobby the New York City authorities to name that one Times Square. And of course, that's today why it's still known as Times Square. Unfortunately, there's no Herald at Herald Square anymore, but the name persists. So in addition to the technology and the economic upheavals, as you guys, of course, are familiar, many of us weren't around then, but we've all seen the footage. There was social and political upheaval, very comparable to the kinds of fractious relationships that the press faces today with the White House today. We saw, obviously, in the 60s and 70s, and in fact, the New York Times in particular, and the Washington Post, other publications faced very real threats as they published leaks like these ones from the Vietnam Task Force. This was the Pentagon Papers, almost shut down the New York Times. In fact, went all the way to the Supreme Court. Luckily, the New York Times won that. But very real threats to the publishing model, the industry, and the social basis for what we were all trying to do. So in that context, I want to lean in a little bit to this notion of channels. And I think, one of the thinkers at the time, the 60s, Marshall McLuhan, famously said here in this, well, he didn't say it in this cameo role at Annie Hall, but he said the medium is the message. And I think, as people recognized at the time, and in that Annie Hall sketch, I guess they were debating, and he kind of stepped in to resolve it. What he's really trying to tell us is that the channel, the way, of course, that we get our content to people, defines to a very large degree what it is that we actually have to say, and how we produce it, and what the content looks like. So if you just focus on print before you even get into the electronic and digital medias, the kinds of publications, the kinds of articles and reporting that you do in a fancy, high-end, glossy magazine store like the one on the left in Berlin the content in those publications obviously is going to look very different from the kind of content that you're going to have to put into a publication distributed to, in this case, a emerging market audience through a paper delivery channel here on the right in New Delhi. And so when we get to the electronic media, the reality is that we basically had print and then we had two more channels. We had radio and television. We eventually got digital, but the reality is that in about 2 generations, for most of those electronic media, very little changed about them. They got a little prettier, we got some color on the front page, and eventually throughout the rest of the newspaper, and our radios and TVs sort of look a little bit better, more compact. You can maybe have a few more channels on them, but structurally there wasn't an enormous upheaval. So of course, as everyone here is very familiar, going into 2000s, this looked great, and strategy teams like mine at the Times were happily drawing projection charts that looked like that. That's what strategy teams like to do. That's why we get the kind of big bucks, not really. But of course, what actually happened was that. And that's why we're all here. That's why we're trying to figure out what's going on. And that was the story for the incumbents, the newspaper industry, which really hasn't recovered since its peak in the 70s and 80s. But of course, like with any disruption, these incumbent traditional publishers like the Times are not the only players, and an emerging set of digital native companies has risen up and to some extent replaced some of the employment and investment that was there. But as I think Jeff made the point very well yesterday, when you actually look at the kind of work that's being done, what jobs are in these new organizations, they're starting to look very different. So this is a graph of reporter job postings versus job postings for content marketing or audience development roles. And of course, I think Jeff made this point that we're seeing dramatic growth in the second of those things. 4 times more job postings for content marketing roles just over the last 3 or 4 years compared to the traditional roles like reporting that are relatively flatlined, if not unfortunately declining. So there's an obvious reason for that, and that's that digital wasn't just one more channel, one more medium to deliver one more message through to add to the other 3 traditional electronic and print media, but instead it was just this successive wave after wave of tsunamis of new forms of media and new forms of distribution channels that the publication industry had to adapt to. First the web. At the New York Times, we finally had our web stuff together. We developed a paywall, things were looking great, and then all the audience was shifting to mobile. Then we have social, then we have messaging, and of course video. Just to focus on messaging and social, each of these waves has enormous impacts on the way that we have to produce and source and distribute the content. So to take the rise of social, we saw just while I was there at the Times, and these are sort of rounded publicly available figures, that the number of visitors to the homepage of major publications like the Times, as in people directly starting their journey in the morning or whenever at the homepage, in this case nytimes.com or Washington Post, dropped by basically half, and most of that traffic was replaced by this incredible doubling in traffic that was sourced from social media, basically almost entirely from Facebook. And that seemed okay from an economic perspective, but the problem is, of course, the kinds of content that you get when you're going to the homepage of the New York Times isn't always exactly the same as the kind of content that you're likely to get if you're scrolling through your Facebook feed. The esteemed editor of the New York Times would love you to read about this important news about climate change and the Environmental Protection Authority, but this adorable cat has somehow gotten its way into this, rolled up brown tube, and I kind of want to find out why. I'm probably equally likely to click on that one. We all are, right? It wasn't a problem that you faced when Dean just laid out the papers sitting on the breakfast table. Luckily, the industry figured out how to solve this problem, right? And it's obviously a traditional problem that people are familiar with. Anyone that's ever tried to feed their kids or someone else's kids, you want them to eat the vegetables, but there's this world of candy out there for them. And of course, as we all know, there's a solution to that problem. It's all in the way that you package and produce that content. And so, what does the climate change vegetables look like if we adopt this approach to packaging our content for the new digital channels that we've got available? Well, organizations like the Times and all of the quality publications you guys represent figured that out. You have to put together the pieces in new ways. You have to find interdisciplinary ways of combining the expertise of, in this case, videographers, cartographers, data scientists, and others in order to tell stories through each of these channels in ways that capture the best available storytelling mechanisms. So that sounded great. We figured it out. We got all these new toys, wearables, mobile, obviously, as it continued to grow. Organizations like the Times then started to just diversify the way that we produced and packaged and optimized the content. We saw different audiences doing different things at the ends of these channels. People on their watch just wanting quick alerts about something important. They don't want a little teaser headline. They just want the fact, whatever happens. So we developed custom text, in this case for the Apple Watch, to not deliver a headline you tap on, but just to tell you what happened as a sentence. It's not a summary or an introduction or a lead. It's just a statement. For the mobile phone, we realized that people want to get, again, a kind of a more paragraphized or bullet pointized version of the story. So we have these sort of downstream editorial processes that got developed to deliver content to people in those channels for the use cases that they were most likely to be in the middle of. And then we had wholly new forms of digital media and channels that we started to experiment with. So the New York Times VR app, for example, was very successful. I'd love to show it to you, but it doesn't look quite as cool when it's on a screen compared to having it on your head. All of these were various kind of operating systems and physical digital media. And in addition to that, of course, there are also application layers. In this case, this is a Snapchat video. A friend of mine, a great reporter, Emily Rube, did this series actually called New York 101, where she ran around New York and just told the story of how the city works, where we get the water from and why there are always potholes in the roads and, how does the subway work and that kind of thing. And I think what's amazing about these kinds of stories is, you just wouldn't have imagined 5-10 years ago that you'd see something like that in the New York Times, right? Because, there's sort of hand-drawn little arrow and some kind of blue font on there. But fundamentally, the reporting that she's done to tell that story was the same reporting. It's just that, we then had to recreate, repackage, represent the content for that particular audience on that particular channel, in this case, younger people on Snapchat. The exact same story, by the way, I should say, looked like that when you're on the web, more traditional looking. Some of the cartoony pictures are, reused, but basically looked very similar. And in print, there was a comparable version. So to sort of pause and recap, what's going on here? Suddenly, we've got a whole lot of channels, right? We started with print, and then basically through the 90s and 2000s, we had this new thing called the web. Stuff looked pretty solvable. We eventually figured out the paywall to get some money out of it. Steve Jobs in 2007 came out with the iPhone. So basically by 2010, we had this second physical or operating system device, the mobile web. So in 10 years, we kind of got one extra device and reorganized teams and split web development teams off into mobile development teams. Suddenly, 5 years later, we had 9 or 10 separate operating systems and physical devices. The web, the mobile web, we suddenly had to develop native iOS apps as soon as they opened up the App Store for the iOS devices, which was separate between iPhone and the iPad. Apple came up with a watch, which everyone thought would be a huge deal for a little while. Android devices came out with their smartphones and tablets, each requiring, again, separate native experiences because the users really expected that kind of strong native experience. Amazon came out with the Kindle Fire. Windows briefly had this phone, which they also, were quite keen on having people develop native apps for. And on top of that, we had the application layer sitting on top of these operating systems and devices. Content that did better on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Snapchat, through messaging devices, each of them requiring some kind of customization. And of course, that story just continues. This chart here is a chart just of substantial social media and messaging apps that have either over 100 million users or are dominant in at least one major market around the world. Some of them, like this weird squirrel thing in the corner, these have like hundreds of millions of Chinese users. I can't even remember what that's called. Maybe someone in the audience does. Does anyone know what that one is? I think it's YY. The one in the, say again? WeChat. WeChat's one of the other ones, I think. That little squirrel, is that WeChat? Anyway, maybe it is, maybe you're right. So on top of that, of course, that's just what the users are seeing. And spare a thought for the marketing teams, the people pushing out the content who are looking at a series of middleware layers that look like that. And of course, that's only one part of it because then you zoom out and you see all the other application providers, many of whom we'll get to chat more with and some of whom are in the audience, I think, today. So what's the big point here? There's just too many channels. We have 3,000 people at the New York Times. When you've got 50 different channels, each with different audiences, different user expectations, different kinds of people at the other end, eventually you can't just keep doing this. You can't keep making new and new experiences for every single channel and identifying and learning about the audiences at the end of each one. There's got to be some other way that emerges for us to figure out how to tailor the content, find the audiences, and deliver the content to them that they need. And so I guess the rest of this talk is forward-looking at a way that I think is emerging to do this. I want to kind of frame it properly, which is to say this isn't something everybody can do today. It's not something that right now is moving large audiences from one place to another, but it's a nut that I think a lot of tech and data science people have been working to crack for many years, and I think is starting to show some interesting signs of opportunity for people. And so traditionally, the way that you would think about how to target and find people at the other end of your content, this was a segmentation and targeting problem. There have been basically these 4 ways of doing segmentation. You can find people by geography, you can talk about how old they are and their demographics, and then there are these sort of psychographic and behavioral approaches to segmenting audiences. But all of these things have had major limitations right from the very beginning. The geography and the demographics of your audience, especially in a digital context, they're pretty largely irrelevant. That climate change article is probably just as relevant to a 17-year-old student in Wyoming as it is to a 60-year-old person in Auckland, New Zealand. So how is the geography or the demographics actually helping us there? So then you say, okay, well, let's go into psychographics and behavioral segmentation. And the big problems with that are, of course, largely it's a lot of guesswork. Anyone that's ever been in a sort of brainstorming session and looked at the kinds of labels that emerge from psychographic segmentation, it's helpful work. It's often the best that we can do, but it's largely guesswork that you kind of then test after the fact and kind of reassure yourself that the labels you came up with were the right ones. Turns out they're often basically demographic labels anyway. And ultimately the more fundamental problem with them is that when it comes to people's beliefs and their behaviors, it turns out, most social psychology these days suggests that those are more effects than they are causes. So in other words, whether I'm interested in that climate change article is less about have I sat around and decided that climate change is something important or not, and more a function of my tribe. Who are my friends, who's my community, who's my tribe? And that's not really defined by any of these 4 things. What it is defined by is the social graph, right? And people, I think, started to learn about what this means when Facebook started to talk about it a lot. And Facebook, of course, talked about it a lot because they've got the most data on the social graph than anybody. But the social graph on Facebook is just one example of this broader idea of a network graph. And so I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes, because I think it's kind of interesting, just to talk through briefly what that is, or remind people that know about that already, and give an example of how you can see in this unsupervised way, clusters and segments actually emerge naturally from network graphs in ways that are just orders of magnitude more powerful if we're able to kind of finally crack this nut than I think the traditional ways of segmenting and targeting are. So network graph basically is a pretty simple math idea. I'm sure you guys already know this. You've got nodes that can be people or things or web pages, and you've got connections between those nodes, which in the graph theory lingo are known as edges. So Facebook in its graph will use these terms explicitly. And the edges are just relationships. So if you're talking about web pages on the web, the edges could be links between pages. If you're talking about friends on Facebook, then the links between people are just friendship connections, or on Twitter, they're followership connections. They can either be 2 ways or they can be 1 way. So that's basically it. That's the whole starting point for the network graph theory, which is this entirely rich branch of mathematics that lets you figure out all kinds of incredible results about what's going on in these graphs. One of them that's worth pausing on for a second, because it's most relevant to segmentation, is this notion of community, or in graph theory lingo, modality groups. So community is just exactly what you'd think it would mean in the context of a society. It's just a group of nodes. In a society, those could be people that are just more connected to each other than they are to other people. So somebody in this room might know somebody at the conference on, I don't know, pediatric something. But this community is more connected to each other than it is to that community. There'll be maybe 1 or 2 connections between the two, but all those guys are also more connected. They're one community, this is another one, they're connected. To give you another couple of examples, the one on the left here is political blogs. So you look at the links between the political blogs, and you can see, of course, there's this sort of segmentation, this kind of bifurcation into the more Democrat-leaning ones and the more Republican-leaning blogs. The one on the right I really love. I'm curious if anyone has seen this before, can guess what the one on the right is. There's this similar kind of polarization in the community on the right. The one on the right is actually a community of dolphins in New Zealand from a scientific study into the bottlenose dolphins. And what they did was just defined a relationship between two dolphins that kind of hung around a little bit. So that's sort of their sort of Facebook friend adding function there. And we can see there's obviously some disconcerting polarization in the New Zealand dolphin community following the results of the 2016 election. So that's all very great, but we probably don't care as much about blogs and dolphins as we care about people and how we get content to them. So what does a social graph of people look like? Rather than share someone else's private data, this is my personal Facebook friend data. So each dot on the screen there is someone who's connected to me on Facebook, and every line in this incredible mess is a connection between those people if they themselves are friends independently of me. And so the first thing that really stands out about this kind of data is that it's just a huge mess, and there's a hell of a lot of it there, and it's very complicated, and I'm only one person, so if you wanted to draw insights out of a 100 million person audience, suddenly you can see why this is an emerging field. And as promising as it is, there's a lot of computational and technological problems that need to be solved to get something interesting out of it. So I want to just kind of walk you through how some patterns can emerge from this data that are interesting, and just do this sort of segmentation for you live if you like. So this is my friendship graph. What you can do in order to start to get some data out is you can have a look at individual friends who they're connected to. This is just a way of kind of pointing at any one friend in the group and looking at which other friends they know. Some are more connected to others, and others are obviously kind of a little bit more on the edge and don't know so many other people. And then what you can do is start to impose some physics on it. And why that's interesting is because it starts to let us get at the patterns that underlie there. And as computers get more powerful, especially cloud computing, and we do this sort of, in third-party servers, we can start to actually get some really meaningful insights out of this massive data that otherwise doesn't really give us very much. The approach that's taken here is you kind of define some gravitational force, if you like. You kind of pull the points together genuinely with a simulation of the physics effect of gravity. And you start to see some clumping. It's still a bit of a mess. And then where the magic emerges is you say, okay, well, we're not just going to apply gravity to the whole thing, but we're going to say there's going to be more gravity between 2 points if they share more connections in common. And then suddenly magic happens. I haven't told it anything about me. All I've given it is a dump of friends from Facebook and who they're connected to, nothing else. And the algorithm itself, iteratively, this takes a lot of computational power, is able to discover these clusters. And these clusters look a lot like what marketers will talk about when they say the word segmentation, except that no one's brainstormed any kind of, soccer mums and rising achievers or confident retirees or anything. All we've done is just taken a dump of the data from Facebook and asked this algorithm to iteratively look for connections between people, move them together if they have more connections in common, and otherwise let them drift further apart. And on that data alone, what we've seen is we've got a bunch of people up here in the top right that I went to grad school with, some guys on the left here up in the top that I did a lot of consulting with. They all tend to know each other more than other people. Folks on the edge that maybe I don't know as well, and knew a couple of friends but don't know others. And from very little input from the user, and certainly no external kind of hypothesizing, we're able to see the segments of my own personal community. Folks in the Times, college friends, my sort of dwindling circle of high school buddies and people from my hometown in Sydney. Some people have, more centrality. There was the co-founder at Purpose, my first startup, who I went to college with, so obviously they're in the middle there of, the kind of college and the Purpose crowd. My ex-girlfriend who knows everybody just because she met them through me. Some of these are great insights, some of these are slightly depressing. But what this means, if you wanted to target me, you wanted to understand how to reach my friends, now suddenly you haven't had to do any brainstorming sessions with any sort of $1 million marketing consultancy firms. Straight from a data source that we used to be able to download from Facebook, you can no longer, unfortunately, get access to this data directly, but there are other ways to do it. You can figure that out. So now you may or may not care about me and my friendship group, but what about the 2016 election? So this is one of the partners that we've been working with a little bit at MIT Media Lab. great research professor there called Deb Roy has a group called the Electome Project, and they looked at the 2016 election. And this is data from the social graph of people following different candidates in the 2016 election, and you can see some incredibly rich structure to the community following in the red cloud, of course, the Trump campaign, in the more dispersed blue cloud, the Clinton campaign, and the yellow were affiliated with the Democratic candidates, but originally were followers of the Sanders campaign. So straight away, without having to pay overpriced sort of strategy consultants, you can develop all kinds of insights into how to reach these people, what messages are likely to work, even just who to test messages against. So just to take a slice through the data, for example, this is the Clinton-Trump axis, if you like. By the way, you can see straight away, before you even do any analysis on this, just some fascinating insights. The Clinton campaign followers here, obviously a little bit more diverse. They were kind of split into coalitions of different interest groups that were coming together, but were not really as tightly kind of identifying with each other as this very dense kind of Trump circuit in the bottom right. If you zoom in, you can look at what things they were talking about. You can actually discover that, that cluster on the top right were, a lot of people clustered around the Black Lives Matter movement and racial justice issues. This sort of offshoot on the bottom left here, kind of doing its own thing and talking about education, which, anyone that's been involved with education campaigns will recognize as sort of a familiar thing. There's kind of weird coalitions that form around education and vouchers and stuff that don't seem to fit neatly into the left-right axis. Economically focused people here in the middle, but also a little bit on the Trump side. The reason why that's critical is if you're trying to test a message and you just throw it into the cloud, you're not going to get the signal to noise that you need. You're not going to discover the content that's going to resonate as you can when you can see these naturally emerging communities and test something, try content, develop communities targeted specifically on groups that are naturally emerging from the data. So that's the promise of it. Facebook itself, this is some work that they have published actually on the same issue of political polarization, looking at conservative and liberal audiences and understanding a little bit about how their graphs connect or don't connect. And it's I think, fascinating stuff that's still in development. So I think Jeff put it well yesterday when he said, okay, well, great, what can we do with this? So what? And the answer is, of course, in the short term, not a great deal yet. But what we want to get out of it, I think, is a set of very real goals that are increasingly becoming achievable. Firstly, we would like to segment properly. We want to segment based on real affiliations between people, the kind of root cause of all the things I think about the world, which is generally just who my friends are and what my community is. We want to target effectively in an environment where we're no longer the ones increasingly distributing the content. Dark social or messaging apps are peer-to-peer distribution mechanisms that we have even less control over than we did over Facebook. We would call that at the times dark social because you would just see a reference pop up, on your Chartbeat, statistics, and you had no idea what the reference source was. And of course, it was just someone sending it via an instant message. That is currently the fastest growing. It's overtaken already in the last couple of years the user base of the social platform. So it's only going to get more and more important. Third thing we want to do is identify niche audiences. If there's some strongly affiliated group that is off on the corner there that we haven't really noticed because they're not big yet, but something's deeply resonating with them, we really want to see who they are and figure out how many more of these people we can find. Develop more content for them. Predict what content to create, and especially including native content, where part of the business models, a key part, for many organizations, the only growing part of the business model is around developing native content that you can actually attach an audience to. And as I think also we heard a lot from the panel and from Jeff's talk yesterday, reducing the cost of getting that content to them. If you know who they are, what they're interested in, what their groups are, in a more sophisticated way than you get from the kind of very rough psychographic and demographic segmentation, we can reduce the cost of getting content to them, really for two reasons. Firstly, because the content we make for them is much more tailored, so if they're more likely to like it, they'll click through at higher rates, etc. Obviously, the cost goes down. But secondly, we can increasingly rely on direct peer-to-peer distribution. And if you can get something to people that they're genuinely interested in versus sort of this averaged effect where you lose the signal of some extreme interest because you've averaged over a group of people that you really didn't need to target it to, then you can get stuff that goes more viral within their communities. And I think lastly, what's particularly interesting, especially for people, like at New Economy Lab, where we're working a little bit on this question of political polarization, you want to measure the impact of the content on the way that people think and behave and what they understand. And I think you can increasingly do that if you can see how the connections between them, other people they follow, and other media sources evolve by looking at who they're following and what they're sharing. So I guess where I wanted to just leave this was with this great hype cycle graph. You guys are probably familiar with this Gartner hype cycle, where any new technology starts with this sort of new idea, and then people get really excited about it, and then they realize it wasn't such a big deal after all. But then eventually they kind of overcorrect and they realize that actually maybe there is something there and they can use it. I think this kind of segmentation, this kind of unsupervised network graph cluster analyses are going through this same kind of traditional cycle, where we've had some early attempts through listening tools, very early stuff like Clout in the early days, influencer tools. There was some great startups like Scale Model, which had a go at productizing this, didn't quite hit the market. Scale Model, I think, just closed down last year. So I think where we're at is kind of getting near a peak where this technology, again, becomes useful, because ultimately it really is the reality of how people are connected to each other. So there has to be some way to turn this into a mechanism for getting content to people. And I just wanted to give a bit of a shout out, I guess, to where the state of the art is on it, which is to say there's some incredible research being done on the academic side out of a couple of the sort of usual suspect institutions, as well as Facebook and Yahoo actively have teams developing more productizable versions of this, and research that they are also publishing. On the product side, Swayable, which is a quick plug for something we're working on at New Economy Lab. Affinio, which I don't know much about, but I have stumbled across, and they're doing this same kind of unsupervised cluster-based segmentation. Looks very promising. It's a group out of Canada. A shout out to Scale Model, which developed this, as I said, out of BetaWorks in New York. And for people that are interested in learning a little bit more about the underlying math and the popularization of it, Sandy Pentland from the MIT Media Lab has a great book called Social Physics, and there's sort of a more basic treatment of network and graph theory and Gladwell's tipping point from a few years back. So basically the promise is hopefully that by understanding these communities, we can start to break out of this sort of horrible rut that we found ourselves in, where our communities have basically segmented themselves. And the audiences for publications like the New York Times that really aspire to reach everybody and just say the truth about things that matter in the world, like climate change, like other big issues, we can start to understand what is it about these other communities that we're not understanding. How can we reach them with important information that goes beyond the kind of cat videos, or the Drudge Report kind of stuff potentially that they're going to look for themselves. And then how can we become a little bit more effective at doing our job of informing them and kind of turning around this terrible decline in the trust in our job and what we do as media organizations that we've been seeing for the last few years. And I think hopefully is going to bounce off the bottom and head in the right direction soon. So I'll leave it there, and we've got about, I think, 10 minutes if people wanted to either share questions or arguments or
thanks
thoughts.
James.
Yeah.
That's great. We're going to take a little audience Q&A, so we'll pass around some mics. Does anybody have a question to kick things going?
I think in the front here, yeah, here you go, and they'll hear.
Hi, Michael Brown, CEO of Sentiment Machine Learning Startup. You mentioned two things really that I'm super interested in. I think from a segmentation perspective, how do you account for overfitting when actually implementing some of these models, especially within commercial media environments, programmatic media environments in particular? And do you think there's a place for reinforcement learning in some of these models to be able to get to some of the true commercial use cases, some of this segmentation-based technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I wish I could give you a definitive answer. I mean, I think the application of this kind of, unsupervised segmentation, I mean, that's the kind of holy grail. I mean, I think the pathway is sort of relatively clear, which is to say, look, ultimately you want to define groups or tribes, give them some name, and figure out what kinds of content ultimately the people who, ultimately don't care as much about the data science, they just want to write the articles, they want to get out in the field and write something, just tell them who they're writing it for and give them some rich information about this crowd, let them learn about them. You want to say the right things to them. So I think that sort of pathway seems relatively clear. The end use of it probably looks a lot like current segmentation, but the way that we develop those segments themselves is ideally, I think, going to get swapped out with this untrained version. In fact, Scale Model, I'm sort of sad that that company folded because I actually thought they had a really good product. They had a way to actually even just spontaneously label the segments. It would actually look for phrases that were more likely to be used by each cluster and group and deliver that up as the label for the group. So you could see how sort of tantalizingly close that was to basically swapping out that initial segmentation process.
What place do you think this has from an ad slot width and ad slot height and pricing perspective in programmatic environments?
Sorry, say that again?
Does this have a place in programmatic environments, do you think, in terms of stopping the decline of, segmentation is a problem in programmatic environments because the more segmentation you have, the worse your price is, right?
Totally.
So how do you think some of this tech applies in programmatic environments?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most tantalizing opportunities here. I mean, everybody wants to kind of find a way to beat Facebook at its own game. Facebook just has all this data. No one's allowed to have it. And by the way, we're going to sell you access to it at our price. And you'll just pay whatever we ask you for. So the idea that you might know a little bit more about the audience maybe one day than Facebook can tell, I think is great. And I think, again, there are sort of pathways in that direction. If I know who my tribe is and I know it because of connections that I'm able to discover, and then I can test content that Facebook may or may not know about, there's certainly a path there, yeah.
Ooh. Question back there, go ahead.
Yep. Thanks for sharing, James. Oh, I'm back here.
Oh, sorry, yeah, it's just like you're booming from the, hi.
Yes. So, by the way, I'm slightly more affiliated with James since I work at the Times, but I did want to ask, a big conversation for a lot of folks in the room is about disintermediation and distribution of content, losing that connection with your audience. But a lot of your presentation, you're talking about the opportunity being with these platforms that are promoting these community-based affiliations. And I wonder how you see legacy publishers that have built up their entire growth and model around mass distribution and not necessarily being associated with particular communities or niche audiences? Or do you think that the future of media is going to be more like what the information has done, where they've dug into a topic, they've become experts, and then they've leveraged and built a community around that particular topic?
I guess my hope, it's a great question and it's good to see. I guess my hope, and maybe this sort of reflects my sort of continuing loyalty with the Times and the hope that it continues to succeed. I mean, I think it's not necessarily an either or thing. I mean, I think there'll always be niche publications, and I'm really glad the information has come up as an example, because I'm just such a fan of, I think it's Jessica Lesson and that team have created this extraordinary, it's just such a hope for the industry. They get their $30 a month out of me, and I'm very happy for them to take it for my 2 articles a day. But I think the kind of work, and I think Jeff referenced yesterday at the Times, how there's now this incredibly burgeoning newsletter-based audience, for example, is I think a nice illustration of how even a very general interest publication, there's a fractal quality, if you like, not to get too sort of math geeky, about the audience, where, yeah, they're one general interest group, but within it, of course, there are sub-communities, and within the sub-communities, there are sub-communities. So the Game of Thrones newsletter list, or the Australia newsletter that the Times is doing very well with, the Canada list now, I think are great examples of how within this broad 100 million user audience around the world, there are deep pockets of interest in certain sub-communities. And by identifying them, I think right now the way it's fair to say the Times does it is relatively trial and error. We kind of know there's a lot of Canadians, let's throw a Canadian newsletter at them, works. But for every Game of Thrones newsletter, who knows what kind of amazing newsletter would have gotten even greater growth, or even wider audiences, or potentially new audiences in geographies or demographic groups or cultural groups that we haven't reached yet, if we'd had more insight into the actual underlying connections among the community and did it in less of a trial and error way. So I guess the hope would be that, both for the general interest publications and the special interest publications, that this would offer a way of unlocking insights into who you can make content for and who you are making content for, that just let you grow more quickly. Had a whole bunch of other questions before, yeah.
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. My question is, the commercial aspects of this seem, really clear, becoming clear, very exciting. But in your research, have you given thoughts to the privacy issues around this and the impact of further polarizing a society that's already suffering from that self-polarization?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I actually think about that a lot, and I think everybody really does need to be careful about that question. I mean, I think like any new technology, it can be used for good or for harm, you know, whether that's the wheel or fire or, you know, or whatever it is, right? So I don't think I'd want to pretend that this is definitely going to be a good thing. You know, if the Russian propaganda units sitting in, Vladivostok, are able to use this to target people, to influence the next election, obviously that's not great. It's certainly one application. Or if people use it to find ways of lying, to each other in ways that are kind of propagandistic, I think that's a problem. So I guess where I personally landed with it is to say that transparency, a set of values that are at the core of the organizations that use this kind of technology are just increasingly critical. There needs to be full transparency around what you're doing. There needs to be full ability to opt in or opt out of sharing any data, and not in a kind of sneaky way, not where there was some fine print and nobody looked at it and it said you've given away the shop and all your private data, which is currently, I think, the way a lot of tech companies operate by default. But that we're very transparent about what you're doing. And I think that if those values are really imposed and if we all sort of sign up for them from the beginning, hopefully this is a way to decrease, not increase the polarization, because it allows us fundamentally just to tell the stories in a better way. I don't believe that people on the other side of the filter bubble from the New York Times readership, which is no secret, is dwindling in terms of its conservative makeup and is growing in terms of its liberal makeup. I don't think that they fundamentally don't care about the environment or don't want to read about stories about climate change. I just don't think we've found the right way to tell the stories for those audiences. And I think that the targeting technologies like this offer a way, I think, to tell important stories for distinct communities in ways that are just more effective rather than ways of just sort of imposing our will and our view of the world on people.
Patrick Crane with BlueConic. Thank you. That was incredible. So I have a question, kind of putting myself in the shoes of a publisher. So let's say we get these tools, and now we have the ability to use this targeting. A lot of the things you were referencing, a lot of the words you were using, harkens back to the fact that I have an anthropology and psychology undergrad, and that's the kind of stuff that I talked about in like my heavy theory classes. Should publishers be looking not only for these tools, but a new talent stream, a new kind of mindset, and what kinds of people and skill sets should they be looking to bring on to take advantage of this? I mean, do we need to find data wonks who have high-level stat degrees? Should we be looking in the social sciences? And, is there like a set makeup, or is it kind of find the right people that might have the right interests and see if we can put them in a room and make magic happen?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think the skill set absolutely is evolving, and I think it is really exciting that backgrounds like anthropology and social psychology increasingly, are moving out of the theoretical realm into kind of like, this is how you make a media business more profitable. I mean, that's cool. I think it was Corey yesterday on the panel that made the point that there's an additional question, of course, which is, where is the natural owner of that skill set, if you like? And I think, we struggled with that at the Times, 3,000 people, 1,500 in the newsroom. We built up a data science team. And I think, it's super smart people, but of course, you have to figure out how to apply them, and we're applying them just to one publication, and we develop technologies, and it's then just for us. Our user base is one, even if it's one large publication. There's a real role, I think, for intermediary vendors, and that's kind of, basically why I jumped out of the Times to do this stuff, because I think there's some really exciting, problems to be solved in a layer that sits between publications and could be, if you like, kind of amortized across many publications. So, I guess my short answer is probably hire some data scientists, maybe hire some anthropologists, but there's a level of depth that's a little bit too difficult to go to for any one publication. And I think Corey said it best when she said we have to lean on the vendors to prove the value of something that they want to sell us. And ideally, I guess the message for publishers would be to kind of adopt a bit of an experimental mindset in working with emerging vendors. I just wish the sort of startups like the scale models could have been kind of just plugged in, and rather than that kind of, okay, show me your wares, what do you got, kind of relationship that we often take with vendors on the buy side. If there was a bit more of a like, all right, there's something here, get in the room with us, you're kind of part of the team, let's co-develop. And so I think that probably helps too.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up there. James, wow, I think is one way to describe it. That was great and thought-provoking, so thank you very much.
Thanks.